Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Like a Mustard Seed, the podcast of Bethany Theological Seminary. We're going to get right to it. Today, joining us is our Bright Bill Professor of Preaching and Worship, Dawn Ottoni-Wilhelm. Dawn, hello.
Hello.
And also with us is one of our fellow master students, Katie Peterson. Hello, Katie.
Hi.
Ladies, you have the ground.
Hi, Dawn. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm really excited to go over some of these questions with you.
Thanks, Katie. It's always good to speak with smart, interesting, curious students.
So your most recent publication is Preaching Prophetic Care. Will you tell us a little more about what's in it and what it has to say?
This project of this book arose out of my passion for God's justice and also for the pastoral concerns that we have necessarily related to justice. What I mean is that so many of our needs, circumstances, the systems that we are a part of in this world, in order to be understood and seen and heard, we bring our pastoral minds and hearts with us to those concerns, and we start to realize that matters of justice are at play, or injustice are at play around us all the time. And this book arose out of a relationship that Ron Allen of Christian Theological Seminary and Phyllis Shepard of Vanderbilt University, a relationship that we had with Dale Andrews, who died just last year. Dale was a star in the sky of African American preaching in the United States. And Dale's passion for the meeting of the pastoral and prophetic was embodied in his life and all of his ministries. We, knowing him well, wanted to honor him before his death by pulling together essays from some of the best and brightest homileticians in the United States today. We did that. Everybody excitedly wanted to contribute to this volume, so we have a great collection of a number of different essays, all of which bridge this important journey between the pastoral and the prophetic. And all of them cover everything from preaching on specific topics to what does prophetic care mean. And they are geared largely toward teachers of homiletics, people like me who are teaching, more so than pastors in the pews. So it's something of an academic work as well.
In regards to what you're talking about in your book, what do you think are the most interesting and maybe challenging questions that are facing preachers today?
Preachers today are really challenged because worship services in America are changing tremendously. In the last 20 years in North America, we've had a proliferation of different worship styles, different media through which worship is shared, and people's expectations around what is to happen in a worship service and what their needs are have changed tremendously in the last 20 years. So given that there are all different kinds of worship services, there are different kinds of preaching that need to be a part of that. Now, one of the most interesting things is that a Pew Center survey of Americans, United States that is, of course, determined that of the 8 different reasons that people might possibly want to go to worship, number one by far, that is 83% of respondents listed as their number one reason for wanting to attend a worship service, is to listen to a quality sermon.
Wow. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah. It took many of us by surprise. It's both really encouraging and also really challenging, because what do people mean by a quality sermon? What are they listening for? What are they looking for when they hear good preaching? That's a more complicated question, but a very interesting one. Another matter I would name is that in my work with international homiletics, I've learned in the last few years that there's a shared concern around the world right now about the rising tide of nationalism. Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, East or West. The members of Societas Homiletica, the international organization of homileticians, people who teach preaching, unanimously agreed just a couple of years ago that they wanted to focus our attention for a couple of years on fearfulness and the way in which people's fears are coming with them to worship services. So our last conference theme was fearing God in a fear-filled world. What are some homiletical explorations about that? So we had really fascinating discussions around the kinds of things people are afraid of. And in that mix was people needing to address again and again how to meet these very pastoral concerns and fears with what is needed of the gospel of Jesus Christ to be shared. So that combination again of the prophetic and the pastoral was rising to the service.
So based on that idea of fear and the statistic you gave, do you think that pastors are in a position where just a well-executed sermon can curb some of that fear and provide some relief through worship services?
It's an incredible opportunity to address those kinds of fears, yes. And that preachers need to learn more and more about how to do it is undeniable.
Absolutely.
That we need that today. So whereas in the past, preachers may have been expected in previous generations to delineate dogma and to explain the meaning of texts, that's a part of what people are interested in. But more often than not, they want to know the relevance of biblical texts for their lives. They have questions about the nature of God and spirituality, and how does that connect with the traditions of the church, but most of all, for their lives today. How can they be better workers, parents, citizens of the United States, and be people of lively and meaningful faith?
Absolutely. So as worship styles change and the needs of the congregations and humans in general change, do you think preaching holds the same weight as it once did in the world of worship?
I absolutely do. I think Augustine's time-honored purposes for preaching, which were to teach people, to delight people in the gospel, and to persuade people, that those may have shifted over time as to which one of those we emphasize. And for example, since the Puritans landed on this shore of what we now call the United States, teaching was the primary calling of so many Puritan preachers, teaching people verse by verse by verse. Well, that need has, interestingly enough, arisen in the last 20 or 30 years because you have more and more people who may show up for a worship service who have absolutely no knowledge of the Bible whatsoever. So we have to teach, but we have to do it very differently than the Puritans did with 3-hour sermons, right?
Absolutely.
So the use of metaphor, stories, analogies, preaching creative forms of public discourse, all of those things are in need of exploration today, because you can't just do a verse-by-verse exposition and expect newcomers who are completely unfamiliar with gospel, with scripture readings, or any kind of dogmatic outline of theology. They won't be interested in that necessarily, but you can teach them important facets of faith by employing these other ways of discourse and poetry.
So do you think with some non-traditional church backgrounds, such as small churches or house church culture with more informal Bible studies and conversations over formal preaching, do you think that is effective as well in spreading the gospel and helping others know what needs to be heard?
Yes. And you used a wonderful word there, conversational, because there is a whole area of homiletics right now that is growing in this field of conversational homiletics. It's trying to understand how people really do want to be in conversation, sometimes explicitly in a worship service. That is, if you're in a house church, small church gathering, you might actually engage in a conversation back and forth between the pew and the pulpit. If there is no pew and pulpit, of course, in a house, right? It is very conversational. You can ask questions along the way, and learning how to preach in ways that invite people to actually feel welcome to ask questions is an art and really important for today. So yeah, I think these different forms are begging different ways for us to be in conversation with one another. So the person of the preacher, I would also say, is really important. If the preacher is somebody who's always got to have the last word and everything, you're not going to be very invitational necessarily, right? But if you're a preacher who's really curious about other people's faith and believes that God is in the voices and the spirits of the people around you, you're going to want to hear what they think and what the Spirit is moving in their lives too, right? So to help inform and develop preachers who are themselves spiritually attuned and interested is really important to all this diversity that we're experiencing today.
Well, I love hearing how much hope you have and how much excitement you have when you talk about preaching and kind of where things are now and how far things can go. And I've really appreciated getting a chance to talk to you about this and in such a way. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Katie. Always good to talk with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, ladies. It's been a pleasure to have you both here. Listeners, keep your ear out for our next episode. We'll try to get one more out by the end of the year, but if not, we'll certainly see you in 2019. Until then, stay rooted, grow, so that the world flourishes. Thank you.